in the midst of trials. So I wanted to share that. You guys may have some thoughts about that. I thought it was a good response with what we've been discussing in this class. Job can be a challenging book. Seeing what Job endured can be very challenging. What we've seen, and as we wrap up with the last words of Job, outside of a few words he's going to say while God is speaking, Job is looking for answers himself. He's looking for God. And how does Job describe God? With everything we've read and what you've read through 28 through 31, what does Job think about God with respect to where he is? He says things like what? What comes to mind? What's he want from God? Yeah, he wants his case to be heard. He wants his time with God. He wants God to lay out the facts for him so that he can have a better understanding. And Job talks about the wisdom of God, and yet he feels like God has hidden himself from him. Is that what you're going to say? Yeah, he feels like God has hidden himself from him, and so he's looking for this. And yet, isn't it interesting that when God does speak, God does reveal himself? Stephen, what's Job's response once God begins to talk to him?
Well, he's going to listen.
He's going to listen. That's all he does. There is no refuting. There's no back and forth. This whole time, he's wanted to hear from God. Let me present my case. But then when God actually speaks to him, how many questions does God answer that Job had? None. Your hand was halfway up, Hugh. 0. Oh, okay. All right, yeah. 0. And again, that says something about this book. Just as we can learn a lot about Job, and I really love men in the Bible like Benaiah, but look at Job. And when you look at Job and how Job maintained his integrity and how he conducted himself, did he get it all right? No, he didn't. But he continued on with God. And there's something to be said about this great righteous man. So let's dive into the lesson here. Where Ben got it right, where Ben got it wrong. I was telling Nikki on the way here, I don't like the first couple of questions in the introduction on the bar on the left-hand side. Let's talk a little bit about chapter 28 here. Chapter 28 is a chapter about wisdom. It's a chapter that some have questioned, all right, who is really speaking here? Some have thought maybe this was Zophar or Bildad. Is this some continuation or another response from the friends of Job? That doesn't seem to fit because of, if you consider the 3 series of speeches, how his friends, their intensity continued to rise in each series of speeches. And you don't see that here. Some have wondered, why is this chapter here? At times, some think that this is a little bit out of place. My understanding, the way that I wrote the workbook, is that this is a continuation of Job speaking here in chapter 27. And, it is somewhat unique where you have, in many of the chapters, a clear-cut answer at the very beginning, whether it's Eliphaz or Job or Bildad or Zophar responding. And so this seems to be just a continuation from chapter 27. There's something called a inclusio, where it's kind of like a bookend. And it's interesting because at the end of Job chapter 28, verse number 28, he said to mankind, "The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn from evil is understanding." So it's a literary device. It's like a bracketing. And it's interesting when you go back to Job chapter 1 and verse 1, it sounds very similar as Job is being described here in Job chapter 1 and verse number 1. "There was a man in the country of Uz named Job. He was a man of complete integrity who feared God and turned away from evil." So it looks like it's almost like a bookend to some to speak, or some have described it like an interlude or something like that. And so there are some questions about who was speaking here. And I don't think there's any problem if we say that it was Job that was speaking in continuation. If you turn back to chapter 26 and verse number 14, Job said this here, and we could really look at some other verses there, but he said in verse 14 of chapter 26, "These are but the fringes of his ways. How faint is the word we hear of him. Who can understand his mighty power, talking about God? If you turn back to chapter 9 and look at verses 10, 11, and 12, Job again is speaking about the wisdom of God. I'm showing you these verses because in chapter 28 is a chapter about the wisdom of God and the fact that God ultimately has this ultimate wisdom. In Job chapter 9, verse number 10, Job said this: He does great and unsearchable things, wonders without number. If he passed by me, I wouldn't see him. If he went by, I wouldn't recognize him. If he snatches something, who can stop him? Who can ask him, what are you doing? There are many other occasions, and we don't have time to look at all of them, where Job does launch into this display of the great wisdom of God, and that's what we see here in chapter 28. And so I wanted just to share that a little bit. And as you think about this chapter, it's a fascinating chapter. It's a very thought-provoking chapter as you consider who God is, and we'll hear more from God later on in a couple of weeks here. If you think back to Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz, what was their argument about what they knew about God and how situations played out? There were things that they would say, or maybe another question is, what kind of confidence did they have in themselves about understanding what was at play? You guys remember that? Or share, how did they view themselves, whether it was with what they understood about God or how things were playing out? Yeah.
It almost seemed like they were like, listen here, buddy. This stuff just doesn't happen. You had to have been doing something bad, or you weren't being good enough, or, even it was pointed out several times by his different friends that your children must have been doing stuff you didn't know about. Or even if you want to combine any or all of those things, that was almost like that was their understanding of what God was about. And, you had to have done something wrong.
Yeah, and the thought that came to my mind is they thought that they had it all figured out. This is how everything works, right? And so when you look at Job chapter 28, this may even be some kind of refute against that as well, of who ultimately knows how all these things work. It's only God. And as you consider this wisdom that we see here. So if you look at the first 11 verses, let's just read a little bit here. In these first 11 verses, you could summarize these first 12 verses really how true wisdom is really impossible for man to find. And I thought it was interesting. One of the reasons why, looking at some of the questions that I had there, this just seems to be emphasizing the great wisdom of God. Certainly we can be wise. We have books like the book of Proverbs where we can learn wisdom from God and the things that he reveals to us. But this seems to be just emphasizing God's great wisdom as opposed to man. And in verse 1 he says, surely there is a mine for silver, and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the ground, and copper is smelted from ore. A miner puts an end to the darkness. He probes the deepest recesses for ore in the gloomy darkness. He cuts a shaft far from human. Earth is transformed as by fire. So Job goes into this dialogue here, or this whole conversation about mining and the wisdom that men have. What point is he trying to make? If you guys read this already, what point or what contrast do you think he's trying to get across here as he talks about man's wisdom and what man is able to accomplish? Any thoughts, Kevin?
Well, as they search for treasures, and man has the knowledge to do that, to dig and find all these precious things, correct? He's not going to find wisdom on his own. Of God, mindful of 1 Corinthians, first chapter, similar thoughts. We read this chapter.
Yeah, he's not going to find wisdom on his own. And it shows how lacking man can still be, despite these great accomplishments. That was something else that I thought as well. If you put it into things that are taking place today in the 21st century, people going into space, Jeff Bezos and others who are, flying themselves into space, and all the great accomplishments that we have, and yet, man is still lacking. Despite all of this wisdom, we still miss out on this true wisdom. Who can truly find it? In verses 12 through 19, that's what he's going to emphasize. But where can wisdom be found? And where is understanding located? No one can know its value, since it cannot be found in the land of the living. The ocean depths say, it is not in me, while the sea declares, I don't have it. Gold cannot be exchanged for it, and silver cannot be weighed out for its price. Wisdom cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir and precious onyx. And he goes on and just talks about how wisdom is priceless and wisdom is valuable. And wealth can't buy this wisdom. Where can it be found? Not in the ocean, not in the land of the living, not in gold. Verse 20, he says, where does wisdom come from? And where is understanding located? It is hidden from the eyes of every living thing and concealed from the birds of the sky. Abaddon and death say, we have heard news of it with our ears, but God understands the way to wisdom. So God is the key. God is the one that ultimately has this true wisdom. For he looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When God fixed the weight of the wind and distributed the water by measure, I love that. Very similar to what God is going to say later on in the book. When he established a limit for the rain and a path for the lightning, he considered wisdom and evaluated it. He established it and examined it. He said to mankind, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to turn from evil is understanding. So Job speaks about this great wisdom that God ultimately has. And while man can be very wise in his own measures and accomplish great things, and while we can accumulate great wealth, ultimately God is the one that has this true wisdom. And certainly for us to be wise, God has to reveal these things to us, which he has in his word. But verse 28 is a great definition as well. When the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to turn from evil is understanding. So why is Job launching into this? That's a question. Why do you think Job has launched into this whole chapter talking about wisdom? Any thoughts on that? And then the other question is, oh, go ahead. I didn't see your hand. Go ahead, brother.
When I read Job's approach of this, it makes me think of Proverbs, the Proverbs, how he kind of takes on wisdom. It seems this is more than just an intellectual wisdom.
Yes.
It's like 2 plus 2 equals MC squared, that kind of stuff. It's beyond that. It's the idea of, why am I here? What am I serving? Questions that people even ask today. We look at very established people, even today, and then we see they still suffer the very same things. They're unhappy. They still have divorces in their lives. They still have a host of things that we can't seem to quite grasp and say, hey, listen, I have the secret to eternal happiness. Mm-hmm. That's truly with God. Mm-hmm. And that's where, even Job is coming to that realization, because in essence, he's puzzled that I live good. You guys are accusing me of sin, but you cannot point out the sin to me. Mm-hmm. There is no sin in me. Mm-hmm. And yes, that's a sense of self-righteousness, but it's a sense of I am lacking in wisdom, and I am seeking this understanding of why is this happening to me despite my circumstances.
Yeah, Job is certainly looking for those answers for sure, and I don't know if it's necessarily self-righteousness. I think Job is,
I said exactly. I don't think it's self-righteousness.
Okay, yeah, okay. Yeah.
Godly wisdom.
Yeah, and yeah, and he's gonna ask that question, and it's interesting too because, and that's why it's interesting here. This seems. Obviously, it's not it's the wisdom of God and putting a spotlight on the power of God. And it's interesting because Job is eventually going to see the wisdom of God. When God begins to question him, where were you? And when all of that happens, it just forces him just to stop everything. So there certainly is this premium. And that was really why the first question, Job knew about this great wisdom of God. That God is all wise, that he is the one that we have to turn to, that he is the one that knows all things and how all things work together, work out. And yet throughout the book, there were times where he still questioned God. And so question number one, we know a lot of things about God as well. Why do we sometimes still then question God, even after knowing all of this? That was the first question. Why can we still question God after knowing all of this? We can read all of this. People are in agreement with what we just read in Job chapter 28, right? So why did the questions arise in us? How did you guys answer that? Yes, I agree. Oh, okay, yes. Tony.
I was just going to say, because we're human. If we're in pain, if we're hurting, it's hard to understand sometimes.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I was going to say. No one likes suffering. And that is part of life. And so it begs serious questions on our part.
So do you think then, great to see you too, brother. Do you think then, and Tony, I think you're right as well, but should there then be a shift? I'll ask both of you. Should there be a shift within how we view suffering? Because Jesus is very clear, persecutions will come in my name, right? So what do you think about that, Tony? Should there be some kind of shift if we know that this is a part of this walk? What are your thoughts with that? Yeah.
But when you're in the moment, sometimes it's still difficult.
Yeah.
I think we get better at it maybe as we mature.
Yeah. So when we're in the moment, so Justin, when we're in the moment then, what is it that we can do or should do when we find ourselves in this moment, in moments of suffering? We know this great wisdom of God. We have the book of Job. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a lifelong discipline of learning to wait upon God. We get in a hurry. We get in a rush about it. And we try to carve out our own path. But that has never been God's plan for us. So when we can have the maturity to recognize that while it is true, we've been hurt badly, and we feel the sting on account of that, we're going to trust that God has a higher purpose in mind. We may not be able to see it at the time, but we don't want to allow our emotions to get the best of us, or we get carried away.
Yeah, I think all of those answers are great, and I'm not picking on you two by any stretch of the imagination. I just think it's important to really think about this, because Job is a book. This happened to Job. We know of situations where tragedy hits. It happens all the time, right? I know we don't want it to happen to us, but it does happen to us. It's happened to many of you. At some point, it's going to happen to all of us in some shape or form. We're not wishing or waiting until the shoe drops. That's not how we live our lives either. Like today may be the day where everything collapses. Well, now we're missing out on the joy that we're supposed to have. But Job, was living his life. And one thought that I had, and then we're going to move forward here, is I think about John chapter 15, that, abiding in Christ, remembering who we are, the Word abiding in us. And I think that's very important, the love that we show to God by keeping His commandments, even in the midst of suffering. Those are very important things to consider in those moments. Yes, ma'am, then we'll move forward.
Just because our faith is what carries us, and it's not something we can see and hold, it's just something we have and know. We just have to depend on God and know His Word is there for us and keeps us going, knowing that He knows what's right.
Amen. Yeah, knowing that God knows what is right. And when we consider, great observation, great point, this grand wisdom of God that we have here in chapter 28, that certainly should help us out with that. And if that is the case, and it is, that He is the one, I love this idea of limit. He established a limit for the rain. Think about the rain today and the lightning. It's just amazing to consider. And making sure that we consider this as we go through those moments of suffering. Real quick, and then we got to move forward.
It's a good reminder that this home is not our home. This flesh is weak. I agree with everything that was said. while we are still present in this tent, we are still...
My Bible is turned over to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Therefore, we do not give up. Even though our outer person is being destroyed, our inner person is being renewed day by day. For our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable, eternal weight of glory. So we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And the Word of God abiding in our hearts, there's something to be said about that as well. Something to be said about putting those Scriptures to memory, considering these Scriptures even in the midst of these moments. So Job talks about the great wisdom of God in chapter 29. What does Job talk about next? Where does he go? Present, future, or past? Yes. Anybody been traveling down the past? Some good roads down there, huh? Anybody been doing some traveling lately? What's Job talking about in chapter 29? I know you're thinking it. Go ahead and say it. What's he talking about? The good days. Right? He's talking about the good days. Have you guys ever done that? I remember when? 20 years ago? Last week? Look at Job chapter 29. This is one of the questions that I asked you guys as well. What does Job wish he could return to? This was question number 2. Job continued his discourse saying, if only I could be as in months gone by. So that gives us some indication on how long this Job had been experiencing this suffering. In the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone above my head. So you see how Job feels about God. He's left me. He's not watching over me because these things have happened. And I walk through darkness by his light. I would be as I was in the days of my youth, when God's friendship rested on my tent. These words are so heavy, when the Almighty was still with me. So Job is expressing, and this is why it's such a challenge, he just got done talking about the grand wisdom of God. And yet now he's saying, yes, back then I knew that God was still with me, and my children were around me. So he's reminiscing about his children. When my feet were bathed in curds, and the rock poured out streams of oil for me. That's the idea that he was very prosperous. When I went out to the city gate and took my seat in the town square, the young men saw me and withdrew, while older men stood to their feet. City officials stopped talking and covered their mouths with their hands. The noblemen's voices were hushed, and their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths. When they heard me, they blessed me. So the great reputation that Job had, the way that people listened to him in the city, the way that people didn't interrupt him. Now he's being interrupted by his friends all the time. And when they saw me, they spoke well of me. For I rescued the poor who cried out for help, and the fatherless child who had no one to support him. The dying blessed me, and I made the widow's heart rejoice. I clothed myself in righteousness, and it enveloped me. My just decisions were like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I examined the case of the stranger. I shattered the fangs of the unjust and snatched the prey from his teeth. He helped the poor, the needy, the widows. He clothed himself in righteousness. He stood up for what was right. And I think this is important as you consider some of the attacks that his friends had made against him, about the wickedness that they believed he was engaged in, which is why he was going through what he was enduring. And Job said, man, those were great days. Look at verse 18 through 20. What's Job saying here? So I thought, I will die in my own nest and multiply my days as the sand. My roots will have access to water, and the dew will rest on my branches all night. My whole being will be refreshed within me, and my bow will be renewed in my hand. What's he thinking? What's he saying there? What was his assumption about the future? I got it all, and what else? He had it all. What else did he expect about the future? Yeah, everything's going to work out great. He had expectations. Verse 18, I will die in my own nest, multiply my days as the sand. I've been living a righteous life. So he's forecasting, and the future looks really good, right? The future looked really great for Job. That's what he's saying here. Men, listen to me with expectation. His friends aren't listening to him like that. waiting silently for my advice. After a word from me, they did not speak again. My speech settled on them like dew. They waited for me as for the rain and opened their mouths as for spring showers. If I smiled at them, they couldn't believe it. They were thrilled at the light of my countenance. I directed their course and presided as chief. I lived as a king among his troops, like one who comforts those who mourn. That's a pretty good life. Would you agree? That's a really good way to live. So Job is going through all of this, and he wishes that, I wish this is how it could be. We know where he is now. And I'd also think it shows us the character of Job and the fact that I mentioned this chapter here, I think last week or maybe a couple of weeks ago. His friends were attacking his integrity, attacking his character. You haven't helped the poor. You haven't helped the needy. You haven't helped the widows. And Job said, oh, yeah, that's what I did. And everyone saw this. Any other thoughts with this chapter here? It's a great chapter. It's sad at the same time. Why is it sad? What's he going to dive into in chapter 30? Yeah, reality, present day. The past is in the past. And it can be hard sometimes leaving the past in the past. And we can do that sometimes, right? Now Job is back to reality. Look at verse 1. But now they mock me. Men younger than I am, whose fathers I would have refused to put with my sheepdogs. What used to me was the strength of their hands. Their vigor have left them. Emancipated from poverty and hunger, they gnawed the dry land, the desolate wasteland by night. They plucked mallow among the shrubs, and the roots of the broom tree were their food. They were banished from human society. So he goes on here, I think in the first 15 verses, and he talks about how his fortune has changed. People felt, what did he say? If I smiled at them, chapter 29, verse 24, they couldn't believe it. They were thrilled at the light of my countenance. Now, Job says, the worst people in society look down upon me, essentially. They look down upon me like I'm nothing. And these are people I wouldn't even let hang out around with my dogs. And yet that's how they look at me. Verse 9, I'm mocked by their songs. I have become an object of scorn to them. They despise me and keep their distance from me. I put in my notes social distance there. They do not hesitate to spit in my face. Look at that. The previous chapter, everyone wanted to be next to Job. Everyone wanted to hear from Job. Now, the worst in society don't even want to hang around him. So he talks about this great misfortune, where he is right now. Look at verse 16. Now my life is poured out before me, this pain, this expression of despondency, and days of suffering have seized me. Night pierces my bones, but my gnawing pains never rest. My clothing is distorted with great force. He chokes me by the neck of my garment. He throws me into the mud, and I have become like dust and ashes. When he says he chokes me by the neck of my garment, who's he talking about? Who do you think he's talking about? Who does Job say that? Who do you think Job is saying is choking him? God. Yeah. So the language continues to be intense. And he's looking out, verse 20, I cry out for you for help, but you do not answer me. When I stand up, you merely look at me. So he's saying God is essentially just staring at me. He's not making any moves. He's not coming to my aid. He's not answering my questions. You have turned against me with cruelty. You harass me with your strong hand. You lift me up on the wind and make me ride it. You're the cause of my storms, essentially. That's what he's saying. So just consider all of this great contrast between chapter 29 and chapter 30. Yes?
Mistake we make, which is he's letting his sincere feelings about his situation, past and present, dictate what he thinks is true about God, instead of taking what is objectively true about God and letting that shape and mold and guide his feelings about the current circumstances.
That is a great point of application for us to look at the look at the facts, to be objective, to remember who God is, to remember his great wisdom in those moments of despair. in those moments of questions, in those moments when we feel like God is the cause of my storm. And this is one of the hardest things where, Job is saying, well, look, I've been righteous. Yeah, my future is going to be great. I mean, I've been living the right way. So, of course, this is what I think should happen. But it doesn't always work out like that. So you're exactly right. We have to be objective when it comes to finding ourselves in these storms. Verse 24 I thought was interesting too. We got about 4 minutes. Yet no one would stretch out his hand against a ruined person when he cries out to him for help because of his distress. Have I not wept for those who have fallen on hard times? Has my soul not grieved for the needy? But when I hoped for good, evil came. When I looked for light, darkness came. And it sounds like Job is saying in verse 24, no one helped me, which I think is pretty shocking, where he's done so much good for other people, and yet his friends have not helped him either. They've just attacked him. And, Job is saying there's really no one that has come to my aid. And certainly that makes his situation even more disturbing. So I asked you a couple of questions here. When things are going well, and we talked about this at the beginning of the quarter, and I think this is very important, what kind of mindset, what kind of attitude should we have when things are going well, when we are thinking about the future and our nest and our retirement and all these things? What's the attitude or disposition we should have? Yes. Yes.
He does talk about some of the things he thought would happen in his life, that he would have length of days and essentially die peacefully. But he also talks about his focus was not just on himself, but for providing for other people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. His focus, even when things were great, it wasn't upon himself. He was doing great good. He was, as God described him, a servant, and clearly he was serving others. I hear the bell. Is that the 2-minute warning? No, Bud said 2. I got 2 minutes. All right, it's the final countdown. I got 2 minutes. And I think there's something for us as well, as we think about our lives and, how can we serve? I don't think we need to live a life wishing, or not wishing, but anticipating when bad is going to come. We don't know what life holds. We don't know if today is our last day. Could be. But this mindset of Job, and the Proverbs talk about this. The prayer, I think it's in chapter 30, don't give me too much, don't give me too little, so that I might not blaspheme your name. And there's something there about what we're going after. Is it connected to the kingdom being first? Is it connected to God being glorified, whether in the good or in the bad days? Yes, we got about 90 seconds.
I really like traveling.
You really like what? Oh, traveling.
Or irony, and tragic irony.
Irony.
Particularly interesting. And in this case, it's tragically ironic that as Job struggles with the understanding, or trying to understand why he's going through these struggles, his friends are telling him, well, something must have done something wrong, when it's quite the opposite. It's because he was outstanding, and it was because of that he got suggested to save. So it's quite the opposite.
Yes.
And we can't use that necessarily as a gauge of whether we're doing right. We're suffering because we're doing wrong, or we're suffering because we're doing right. We all know the passage that he makes it rain on the just and on the unjust.
Yes.
For everything there is a season. But when it comes down to how do we deal with these struggles, I believe one of the most important passages in the Bible is 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 5, the beginning of 5. Add to your faith virtue. We all know the steps of salvation, but what do we do once we're saved? Add to your faith virtue. To virtue knowledge. To knowledge self-control, steadfastness, godliness, brotherly affection, and love. And we all know God is love. So to fully understand God, fully understand love, we need to add these things. In particular, what I want to look at is steadfastness.
Yeah.
James chapter 1 and verse 2. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. So it's inherent with our faith that we're going to experience trials. And through enduring those trials, we will accomplish steadfastness. And because of that,
Well said. James chapter 1, and I know the bell rang, so we'll wrap up here. James chapter 1 and verse 2 was emphasized. Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 and 44, I believe. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. And I do like this point. I saw somebody talk about this too, where God said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? And there was something, obviously, God understood about Job. And whether or not we suffer because of who we are, there's the proper perspective that we have in the good and in the bad of why we serve God and that we're going to maintain our integrity no matter what. So the last few questions in the workbook are really personal questions for you. And so I want you guys to really consider those questions and to really think about how you would answer those questions. We'll pick this up next week, Lord willing. Please read chapters 32 through 37. I do want to be sure that we talk about chapter 31 next Wednesday, and we're still on track to wrap up the class. So as we leave here tonight, remember the great wisdom of God. Continue to fear God, to keep his commandments, and as Job concluded in chapter 28 and verse number 28, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn from evil is understanding. Let's be sure that we do that. Thank you guys very much.